Welcome to Practicing in the Time of COVID-19. I am Barbara Fast, Director of Piano Pedagogy and Piano Area Chair from the University of Oklahoma. Well, COVID-19 hit mid-semester 2020 while I was teaching a course, Practicing for Performance, for the very first time, that focused on experimentation with new practice techniques. Obviously, by the time of mid-March, when we suddenly went online, as of course you did too, normal practice routines were suddenly obliterated. For instance, how to practice flute in a one-room apartment with a roommate, or how to practice piano keyboard with a roommate who hated the clicking of keys, all became pressing issues. So to back up a little bit, the way I organized the course, it was open to all students, undergraduate through master's through doctorate, and all instruments, including voice. And to give you a background on myself, I double majored flute and piano. I've always been interested in the research on practicing and have done research myself related to it. So it was the first time I was able to teach a course on practicing. I structured the course at the beginning, knowing I might change this structure, but interestingly enough, I maintained it throughout the entire semester. The goal of the course was for students to literally continually experiment with their own practicing. So I started out with a section called Take Action. And usually these suggestions were based on research. For instance, I started immediately with interleaved practice, context-dependent memory, hardest first practice, etc. And those elements did change throughout the semester. I then decided to include what I called a positive tip, knowing that I might abandon this and maybe students would hate it. Really, it was based on positive psychology, various suggestions that came, a lot of them came from Martin Seligman. Interestingly enough, this became very, very popular and students really ran with it, particularly during the time of COVID. How to cope, how to think positively in very trying circumstances. And then the third section I started, and I did keep it going through the entire semester, is what I called getting to it. Knowing that many students have a hard time starting practice or getting to the practice room, and there are so many tips out there based on research, and we experimented with those throughout the semester, and that remained very, very popular. I also had students start with I called it a practice or idea journal. Again, I did not know, I made that optional and I did not know how popular that would be. Most students kept it going in some form or another. And for some students, it became very, very important to them. And then after that, I would have various required readings. I did, for the graduate students, they were required, obviously, to read a few more research articles. So, how this progressed for students. As I kind of wrote in the abstract, after the initial shock of COVID-19 and the shutdown, students gradually began implementing very, very creative adaptations. And I want to emphasize that. I would throw out ideas saying, share the research, experiment with this, and they would find ways to adapt it. They would sort of interpret it themselves, and then they would come back and share that with class, which was hugely inspiring for me, and I think actually for each other. I want to share several of them with you because they were so interesting. One of my favorites that came up relatively early when we were shut down, this was a doctoral flutist. It was her idea. She called it pajama practice, where she described at the end of the day when she was just too tired to practice, she would crawl into bed with pajamas on, open her flute score and put on a recording and listen and literally just watch the score. I was so impressed with this technique as a pianist and knowing how difficult memory is for so many pianists. This is a was a wonderful way of emphasizing oral listening. And I know that she wasn't really doing it for memory work, but a lot of students picked up on that, and it is a wonderful sort of memory test and enhancement. Sort of based, we worked with mapping music pretty early on, which if you're interested in that, check out Rebecca Shockley's book on mapping music, where essentially you draw a picture any way you want, draw diagrams of your score. And I had students do this, first of all, from memory, suddenly in class. How well did they know their music? Could they diagram it out in whatever fashion they wanted? And then they had an assignment to look at the score and diagram it out any way they wanted to. A student took this a bit further and took her musical map and stuck it to her refrigerator. And actually, we were doing a lot of talking about oral listening, and put on a recording of the music she was listening to. And as she was cooking, saying, "Oh, do I know where I am in the score right at this point?" And I thought it was such a creative idea. A couple other students picked up on that. An organ student came up with the idea of portfolio practice. That's what I ended up calling it for him. He took the idea of mapping, and he was memorizing a very large work. And actually, before mapping, I think actually just photocopied very small pages of the work onto a very large notebook that he could put on the organ, and worked with memorizing from that. And as a memory test, if he would forget where he was, did he know where he was in the score? And that became helpful for him as sort of a mental overview and a memory test. Various students developed some sort of buddy practice with each other, or buddy check-in with each other. They spontaneously came up with these ideas. Several students used Snapchat, and this really became a regular thing for them, sharing little practice videos almost daily with each other of things that they were working on. As sort of a summary of the practice strategies that we discussed, I've already mentioned mapping. Interleaved practice I introduced at the very beginning, which is basically rather than blocked practice, where you practice, say you have an hour practice and you practice number 1, number 2, number 3, you take those 3 elements and you intersperse them for shorter amounts of time within the same practice period. There's all sorts of research that shows that there's far greater learning, both in the sports world and in the music world, with interleaved practice. This is so important. I had students keep it going for 3 weeks because it's a very, very hard thing to implement. So I wanted them to take time to experiment with it. And a number of students kept this going in some fashion or another. Again, they interpreted it in their own way. They kept it going through the entire semester. Variable practice was also introduced, and that is, taking your difficult spot, and rather than doing the same practice technique, let's say uneven rhythms with it, varying that practice consistently. Maybe you change the dynamics. Maybe rather than playing it slow, you play it very fast, or vice versa. Maybe play it in a different octave. And again, there's so much research in the sports world that doing this kind of practice is far more effective than kind of playing it the same way, trying to fix it in one way over and over. Obviously, we all know how important listening and video recording ourselves, how important that is, but how difficult it is for students to do. So again, I introduced this fairly early, and that became quite popular. I knew I almost had to force students to do it, or they wouldn't do it. But once they got used to it, they implemented that in various ways throughout the semester. The 2 resources I used very consistently throughout the whole course. One was the book, I Practice, Technology in the 21st Century, Music Practice Room. My co-author, Jennifer Mishra, and I wrote it together. It came out in 2018, Oxford University Press. We really tried to write it in a blog style, but there is just a ton of research in it. It was really all based on research, but written in a very readable, approachable style, hopefully. The other source I used really the most was the blog, The Bulletproof Musician by Noah Kageyama. And again, I liked it because all his writing is based on research, but his introductions to the blog and his writing about the research is very user-friendly. He's very, very easy to read. I wanted to mention another book, Practicing the Piano, Nancy O'Neill Brett on it. Her ideas probably fall more in the category of variable practice. I brought her in as a guest, Zoomed her in. But again, her writing is very readable and it's very approachable for students. I'd like to end my comments by saying it's a comment I've made over and over to students. I made it in March when we went into lockdown. I've also made it at the beginning of this fall 2020 semester because we're still dealing with COVID-19 and the pandemic. And the important, I think, element for students is to realize they will look back on this time in their life. It will be a very marked time in their life, and they will look back on it on how they dealt with these very, very trying circumstances. And I try to emphasize with them, particularly in the practicing course, this is your opportunity to experiment, try new things. The things you're used to doing will not work. They simply can't work. We're in a new situation. So use the opportunity to try new things. I was really amazed with the ideas the students came up with, how imaginative they were, and particularly when they could share their ideas, how inspiring they were for each other. I have to say they were also inspiring for me. I hope this gives you some ideas for practicing to utilize with your own students. Thank you so much for listening.